Welcome back to the channel where kindness meets consequences and the past never stays buried. Tonight's story will take you deep inside a life that once looked picture perfect: polished smiles, warm family dinners, and a husband who seemed to have everything under control. But sometimes, the smallest act of compassion can echo across decades and return with truths powerful enough to destroy everything. Imagine feeding two hungry boys in a struggling cafe, only to have them walk back into your world years later carrying secrets that can shatter a marriage and expose a carefully hidden life of betrayal. This is not just a story about revenge, it's about fate, loyalty, deception, and the quiet storms that reshape families forever. So get comfortable, open your heart, and prepare for a journey where every twist will leave you questioning who can truly be trusted. The winter of 1997 carried a hunger that never seemed to leave the bones. Steam clung to the cafe windows while unpaid bills lay folded beneath the counter like quiet threats waiting to be spoken aloud. Business was failing, hope was thinner than the soup being served, and still, two boys kept appearing at the back door just before closing. Torn jackets, eyes too old for their faces, hands trembling not just from the cold, but from a life that had already taught them not to expect kindness. Plates were filled anyway. Bread was wrapped in napkins and slipped into their pockets as if it were a secret worth protecting. No questions were asked, and none were answered. They ate like they were racing against time itself, glancing over their shoulders at shadows that didn't belong inside a warm room. On one of those nights, headlights cut through the fog outside. A familiar car idled across the street. A familiar silhouette watched from behind tinted glass. It was dismissed back then as coincidence. Marriage had already begun to feel like balancing on cracked glass, but doubt was easier to swallow than confrontation. He had a way of smiling that made suspicion feel like betrayal. He had a way of touching a hand that made every instinct go quiet. Years passed. The cafe survived. The marriage appeared to survive even better. Holidays were photographed. Anniversaries were toasted. A life was carefully polished until it reflected nothing but perfection. Yet sometimes, in the middle of laughter, there were those same headlights in memory, that same feeling of being observed by a truth not ready to reveal itself. Then came the day the doors opened and two men stepped inside. Tailored coats, steady eyes, gratitude written in every line of their faces, and something else, something heavier. They spoke names that hadn't been heard in decades. They placed an old napkin on the counter, still stained with tomato soup and fear, and then they spoke his name. What followed wasn't an explanation. It was a slow dismantling of a life built on rehearsed affection and carefully hidden cruelty. Stories of who had abandoned them, stories of who had paid others to make problems disappear, stories of how a struggling cafe had unknowingly become a safe place from a man who preferred his sins buried where no one could find them. Kindness had fed them once. Now truth had brought them back. And finally, the hunger belonged to him. Polished smiles had always been part of the performance. Candlelit dinners, neatly folded napkins, laughter that sounded rehearsed if listened to closely enough. To the outside world, marriage looked like something carved out of glossy magazine pages, flawless, enviable, untouchable. Inside the walls of that home, however, silence often carried more truth than words ever did. There were nights when he would arrive late, smelling not of work, but of something sharper, colder. Excuses slipped from his lips with dangerous ease. Meetings, investments, opportunities. Each promise sounded reasonable, each explanation designed to keep doubt from taking root. Trust became less of a feeling and more of a discipline. It was easier to believe than to confront the quiet dread growing beneath shared routines. Then the past walked in wearing expensive shoes and steady confidence. Two grown men stood at the threshold one afternoon, their presence slicing through normalcy like broken glass. Recognition didn't come immediately. Time had reshaped them. Hunger had been replaced by determination. Fear had hardened into purpose. But the way they watched him, not with curiosity, not with respect, but with something dangerously close to judgment, made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. They spoke gently at first, gratitude for warm meals given long ago, memories of a small cafe that had felt safer than the streets. Their voices carried warmth, but their eyes never left his face. Something inside him shifted, a flicker of panic, a tightening of his jaw that lasted only a second too long. It was the first crack in the perfect image he had spent years constructing. What followed came slowly, like poison dissolving into clear water. Stories of how those boys had not simply been homeless, stories of debts their parents could never repay, stories of a powerful man who believed problems could be erased with enough money and distance, a man who had watched from across the street while others carried out his commands, a man who later built a life of luxury, convincing everyone he had earned it honestly. Every word peeled away another layer of illusion. Shared dinners suddenly tasted bitter. Wedding photographs felt like evidence rather than memories. The realization that trust had never truly existed settled like a weight no apology could lift. He tried to deny it, tried to laugh it off, tried to turn charm into a shield once more, but the past had come prepared, and gratitude had transformed into something far more dangerous than forgiveness. That was the moment his empire of lies began to collapse, and this time, no one was going to feed him mercy. Hunger had once been the only language those boys understood. Back then, their gratitude had been quiet, almost fragile, expressed through shy nods and hurried smiles before disappearing into the dark. It never felt like a moment worth remembering, just small acts of kindness done in the middle of exhausting days and uncertain nights. Life moved on. The cafe survived. Marriage grew into something that looked stable from a distance, something people admired without ever questioning. Years later, gratitude returned, wearing confidence and purpose. They didn't arrive empty-handed. Their voices were calm, their movements deliberate, as if every step inside that home had been rehearsed long before the doorbell rang. The warmth in their greetings was real, but beneath it lived something colder, a truth waiting to be released at the exact right moment. They spoke of how those meals had given them strength to keep going, how shelter had existed not just in food, but in the feeling that someone had seen them when the world had chosen not to. Then they began to speak of him. At first, it sounded like confusion, stories that didn't quite make sense, a businessman who funded men who thrived on fear, a husband who built opportunities out of other people's desperation. The room felt smaller with every sentence. He tried to interrupt, to redirect, to charm his way back into control. But loyalty had already shifted, and the past had come prepared with details too precise to dismiss. They had grown up. They had learned how power worked. They had followed the trail of money, the whispered deals, the disappearances no one had ever dared question. What they uncovered wasn't just betrayal, it was a carefully constructed life built on the suffering of strangers and the blind trust of a spouse who had never been meant to see behind the curtain. Every revelation landed like a storm breaking through sealed windows. Anger mixed with disbelief. Love tangled itself with humiliation. Memories that once felt sacred suddenly became unbearable to hold. Their gratitude transformed into something fierce, something protective. They weren't there to destroy without reason. They were there to restore balance. Plans unfolded quietly. Documents appeared. Witnesses waited. His confidence began to crack under the weight of consequences he had always believed were meant for others. For the first time, he wasn't the one pulling invisible strings. Kindness had once saved them from starvation. Now their loyalty was going to make sure he finally tasted it. Fate never announces itself politely. It slips into ordinary days disguised as coincidences, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the damage already done. For years, life felt carefully arranged, like furniture positioned to impress guests rather than provide comfort. Shared breakfasts, gentle conversations about future plans, a husband whose presence filled rooms with confidence and quiet authority. Nothing ever seemed out of place until memory began to insist on being heard. It started with small fractures, old photographs discovered in forgotten drawers, receipts from places never mentioned, phone calls that ended too quickly when footsteps approached. Suspicion grew slowly, like a storm forming far beyond the horizon. It was easier to pretend everything was fine than to question a life that had taken so long to build. Then, the past refused to remain buried. Two men arrived carrying pieces of a story that had been unfolding in secret for decades. Their voices were steady, but their words carried the weight of nights spent surviving choices they had never been allowed to make. They spoke of hunger and fear, of running from shadows that wore expensive suits and drove familiar cars. They spoke of a powerful figure who believed compassion was weakness and silence could be purchased. They spoke of him. At first, denial felt instinctive. Love has a way of blinding even the sharpest instincts. But truth doesn't need permission to exist. It surfaced through documents, testimonies, and memories that suddenly aligned with unbearable clarity. Every moment, once dismissed as harmless, began to reveal its hidden meaning. Late-night absences weren't ambition. Generosity toward strangers wasn't kindness. It was calculation, a performance designed to hide a man who thrived on controlling outcomes no matter the cost. Relationships that once felt unbreakable began to crumble under the strain of reality. Conversations turned into confrontations. Affection dissolved into accusations. The home that had symbolized security became a stage where betrayal replayed itself over and over again. And through it all, those men remained, not as intruders, but as witnesses to a justice that had waited patiently for its time. Revenge didn't arrive with shouting or chaos. It unfolded quietly, like a tide pulling everything back into its rightful place. His reputation weakened, his allies disappeared, his carefully protected secrets became public knowledge. The life he had constructed through deception began collapsing piece by piece. Kindness had once been offered without expecting anything in return. Now, deceit was finally collecting its debt. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story.